I'm going to stay chained to the pulpit this morning because of the necessity to have sound for the folks downstairs in the parish hall as well. I don't know what makes you afraid. Some people are afraid of spiders. That ranks near the top of what makes people afraid. When I was in Costa Rica, I was in Drake National Park, and one of the spiders in my room in the lodge was the wolf spider. It's about the size of your hand. It's gray and it's hairy. And fortunately, I had done a night tour through the rainforest with someone who is an expert in spiders. And they said, listen, you don't have to worry about the wolf spider because they eat insects, so that's really good in your room. That's the Bolivian traveling spider you have to watch out for because it's very venomous and it's very aggressive. That wasn't in my room. But it was interesting going to sleep with a spider up in the wall, just hanging there. Or how about snakes? I've had encounters with snakes through the years. My wife actually, I think she's downstairs in the nursery this morning, but she actually killed a spitting cobra in our house in Nigeria. So she's actually quite courageous. Now, a spitting cobra, for those of you who've seen Jurassic Park, you remember the dinosaur that spits the venom into the eyes of the prey? Well, that's the spitting cobra. It can nail you from about 6 to 8 feet to the eyes, the venom. So she was quite courageous. Maybe it's snakes that make you afraid. Or perhaps it's mice or rats. Now, let me talk to you about rats. I'm sitting in a lodge in Swaziland, having dinner. There were two women across the table from me. I'm sitting here, and there were beams running across the roof, and it was an open roof. So there were beams you could see in the ceiling. And as I looked up, I noticed there was a rat coming across the beam that was about that big, about a foot, like really big. In Nigeria, we would say really good eating. I'm not joking. Now, I must say, I was sitting there thinking to myself, the rats don't bother me. And I was sitting there thinking, should I tell the two ladies that right above their head is this giant rat? I didn't. So they continued on with their meal. They were enjoying it. I was secretly smiling to myself what was happening just above their head. In Nigeria, what would happen is you would slash and burn agriculture. So you'd burn the fields, and the rats would come out, and the children, yeah, exactly. The children would stand there with clubs, and they would get the rat, and then they bring it out to the road and swing it by the tail, and people would stop, buy a rat or two, throw it in the trunk, take it home for dinner. I called this KFR. It's the original takeaway. Seriously. I would, after church on a Sunday morning in the village I was working in, went to local church service. I'd often be invited back to someone's hut for lunch. And I never knew what I was going to get. And one day it was rat. Another day it was snake. Groundhog. I could go on through the alphabet. Anyway, it was an experience. Some of you might be frightened of thunder. Now, my dog who's a Shih Tzu, Muggsy, gets very frightened about thunder when storms are coming. Maybe you have that experience. And she literally will jump and shiver in my arms and I'm her thunder buddy. And the dog just stays there when she's very, very afraid of thunder. But there are different things that make people afraid. Sometimes it's loss of job. Sometimes it's a medical diagnosis. Sometimes it's trouble in relationships. There are many things that make us afraid. Sometimes we come to a place in our life and we wonder if we have any significance or meaning. There are things, many of them, that make us afraid. And of course, that's at the heart of our gospel reading from Mark chapter 4 this morning. Mark relies on the teaching of Peter very often in his gospel, and he recounts Peter's experience of being in the Sea of Galilee during a storm. Now, what you need to know about this particular area is the Sea of Galilee is a very shallow lake surrounded by mountains about 3 times a year, and it still happens to this very day. Hot winds will come from 2 different directions over the mountains and come down into the lake, which is cooler. So you have the meeting of hot air and cool air which produces very much the effect of massive storms that come up very quickly and are very dangerous because the water's shallow. If you've ever been on Lake Simcoe during a sudden storm, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. It can be very dangerous because you get high winds, high waves very quickly. And the Jewish people particularly were afraid of water. They were a nomadic people. They were very used to being on the land and the mountains and so on. But the oceans were something that filled them with fear. And that's why when you read the Psalms, Psalm 66, for example, and other Psalms, you'll hear about them talking about God having dominion over the oceans. The fear of Jonah, when we hear that story, Jonah and the whale or the sea monster, has a lot to do with people's fear of the ocean. They were very afraid of drowning and of the ocean and of storms. And so for the people in the Sea of Galilee, Peter and the other disciples in the small boat, most of them, by the way, could not swim. So can you imagine being in the middle of a lake, sudden violent storm because you can't swim, and you're literally afraid of drowning. Your culture has told you water is the thing to be most afraid of. And they were terrified. If you've ever been in a situation where you've been most afraid, maybe you've lost a child in a store. Have you ever had that experience? You've lost your child in a store and there's this moment of panic. Where are they? Are they going to be okay? Having been lost myself, I usually went to the toy department. So you could usually, my mother knew if I disappeared, I was going to be probably in the toy department. So she wasn't probably as afraid as she could have been. But those moments of sheer terror were what gripped the disciples. Now there is one person that the Jewish people acknowledge could have control over nature, and that is who? God. And so in the midst of the storm, Jesus, who had been ministering to crowds, and if you've ever, for those ladies in the congregation who have been serving people at a big family event, you know how tired you get after everybody's left? And you can't wait, in one sense, till the last person's out the door? And you put your head down on the pillow, and you fall, what's the term we use? Sleeping like the dead. Dead asleep. Dead tired. Jesus was very much like that. He'd been ministering to literally thousands of people, just exhausted, gets in the boat, falls asleep, the sudden storm comes up. The disciples are absolutely terrified. They wake Jesus up and they ask him the question, Lord, don't you care about what's going to happen to us? Now, I think one reason Mark included this story from Peter, from his experience in the gospel, was at the time the Gospel of Mark's written, the church is undergoing great persecution. People are being put to death, they're being arrested, sold into slavery, merely because they're followers of Jesus. And they must have been tempted to ask in the middle of the persecution where bad things were happening to them and they hadn't done anything wrong, God, where are you? Don't you care? Mark, probably remembering the story of Peter, thought that that was something that would speak to the Christians, particularly in Rome, as it would speak to the Christians in Syria and Iraq and Somalia. And I can go on and on and on with places around the world today where people experience great persecution because they love Jesus, or because they're part of a religious minority and are made the target of the hate of others. And so the early church would have resonated with these words. And what does Jesus do? He calms the storm. And they ask, who is this? You see, you just can't leave Jesus as a good teacher. He's the one who raises the dead, who does miracles, who calms the storms, and promises to be with us no matter what happens in the storms of life that confront us. You see, it resonates with our own time, because when we focus and encounter those difficult times in our life, and each of us have them, don't they? Those times when you feel like you're going through a desert and you wonder if anyone understands you or loves you. And Mark says in this story, as he recounts the experience of Peter in that boat, when you're surrounded by storms and you think you're going to drown, God is there. And if I can quote the Lion King, that great Swahili term, Hakuna Matata, no worries, because God's got your back. Jesus is there. And so boys and girls, as you come for First Communion, and for those who are coming for baptism and the visitors, when you go through the storms of life, you will never walk alone. That's why in our first reading about David, when he gets almost shish kebabbed by Saul with the spear, David writes a psalm that we use that reminds us of God's presence, the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, what? I will fear no evil, for thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. He knew what it was like to be threatened. And may you proclaim, who is this Jesus who loves us? Amen.